Welcome back, listeners, to another journey into the unknown. Tonight, we venture deep into the shadowy woods, where eerie encounters and ancient secrets await. These forests are more than just trees and trails. They're alive, watching, and hiding things that defy explanation. In this episode, we'll share chilling tales of those who dared to enter these forbidden realms. A park ranger confronting a cabin that shouldn't exist, a wildlife photographer receiving a warning from something not of this world, and a group of influencers discovering a forest that hates technology and them. So, grab your flashlight, stay close to the campfire, and remember, if the woods start whispering, it might already be too late. Let's begin. The disappearing cabin. I've worked as a park ranger for years, and I've heard my share of strange stories. Lights in the trees, voices in the wind, even the occasional Bigfoot sighting. I usually shrug them off, but lately there's been a new tale going around, a cabin that appears and disappears deep in the woods. Everyone who's seen it has refused to go near it, and those who claim they've entered, well, they're never heard from again. The reports finally pushed me to investigate. It was a foggy morning when I set out, radio clipped to my belt and flashlight in hand. The forest was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Even the birds seemed to avoid this area. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I walked for hours before I saw it, a small, weathered cabin nestled between the trees. My first thought was that it looked too clean, almost like it didn't belong. No signs of a trail, no footprints, nothing to suggest how it got there. Then the door creaked open, just a crack, as if inviting me inside. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity won out. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the room was filled with objects, watches, shoes, wallets, even photographs. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, as though untouched for years. I picked up a journal from a nearby table. The entries were frantic, talking about things watching, and the door not leading out. A drawing on the final page caught my eye, a crude sketch of a creature with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, standing beside what looked like the cabin. Then I noticed something chilling. The door I'd entered through was gone. Panic gripped me as I ran my hands along the wall where the door should have been. Solid wood. I turned back to the room, my flashlight casting long dancing shadows. A mirror in the corner caught my eye. Its surface rippled like water, and in the reflection I saw shadowy figures moving, figures that weren't in the room with me. I spun around, but nothing was there. Yet the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I started examining the objects more closely. A pair of hiking boots sat beside the fireplace, the leather worn and scuffed. The initials RT were etched into the soles. A dusty locket lay open on a table, revealing a photograph of a smiling family. In the corner, a child's toy truck rested atop a pile of faded clothing. These were remnants of lives that had ended here, belongings left behind by those who had vanished. Then, another door appeared where there hadn't been one before. Desperate to escape, I yanked it open. It didn't lead outside. Instead, I found myself staring at a surreal, otherworldly landscape that defied logic. The sky was an angry shade of crimson, swirling with dark clouds that seemed alive, shifting and writhing like snakes in water. The air was thick and hot, carrying an acrid metallic smell that burned my throat with every breath. Strange, luminescent plants with spindly, tendril-like leaves dotted the terrain, their glow pulsating faintly in time with a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. Gigantic, insect-like creatures moved across the horizon, their exoskeletons glinting like polished obsidian. They walked on spindly, multi-jointed legs, each step sending tremors through the cracked, barren earth. Their elongated limbs ended in sharp, claw-like appendages, and their heads were grotesque amalgamations of human and insect features, with mandibles clicking and hollow, glowing eyes scanning their surroundings. One of them turned slowly, its gaze locking onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of dread, as though it could see straight through me to the core of my being. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. But the cabin wasn't done with me. The walls seemed to pulse and shift, the objects rattling as if alive. I grabbed another journal, its cover cracked and worn, and flipped through its brittle pages. The handwriting inside was erratic, the ink smudged as though written in a hurry. The entries described a man named Richard Thornton, a hiker who had wandered into the cabin over a decade ago. His words revealed a descent into madness, days stretching into weeks as he fought to resist the creatures that prowled outside the glowing door. One entry read, "I've lost count of how long I've been here. The cabin shifts when I try to leave, always leading me back to the same room. I hear them at night, their claws on the walls, their whispers in the dark. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on." Another entry detailed a horrifying discovery. The creatures had been providing food, leaving small, strange fruits near the glowing door. Richard wrote that they seemed edible, but had an unnatural metallic taste. He theorized that the creatures wanted to keep him alive, feeding on his fear and isolation as much as he fed on their offerings. "It's a game to them," he scrawled. "They want me to survive just enough to feel my despair deepen, to keep me here forever." The final page was smeared with what looked like dried blood. Written in large, trembling letters were the words, "The cabin doesn't let you leave. It wants you to stay. It feeds them." My flashlight began to flicker, and the humming sound grew louder, almost like whispers in an alien tongue. Suddenly, the door I'd come through reappeared. Without thinking, I opened it, but instead of the forest, there was a dark void. A massive hand-like appendage reached through, clawing for me. I barely managed to slam the door shut in time. The walls trembled, and the cabin seemed to close in around me. I found a rusted hatchet among the objects and gripped it tightly. The glowing door to the other dimension reappeared, and one of the creatures pushed through, its limbs scraping against the walls. Its hollow eyes burned into mine as it lunged. I swung the hatchet wildly, severing part of its appendage. The creature let out a screech that shook the cabin, retreating back through the glowing doorway. The cabin began to implode, walls collapsing inward as if being swallowed. I spotted the flickering outline of the original door and made a run for it. With one final burst of energy, I dove through just as the cabin disappeared behind me. I landed hard on the forest floor, gasping for air. The night was still, and the eerie silence was gone. When I looked back, there was nothing left, just a patch of scorched earth. Later, back at the ranger station, I tried to report what had happened, but the words felt hollow. Ridiculous. My colleagues listened politely at first, their faces slowly shifting from concern to skepticism. Maybe it was just a bad dream, one suggested with a nervous laugh. Another pointed out how exhaustion could play tricks on the mind. Their dismissive remarks stung, but what hurt more was the obvious doubt in their eyes. I pulled out the journal I'd taken, hoping it would serve as proof, but the pages were blank. That only deepened their disbelief. "Are you sure you didn't just grab an empty notebook from the station?" one asked. Frustrated and humiliated, I stopped trying to explain. Over the following weeks, I felt myself unraveling. Every time I stepped into the woods, I felt the cabin's pull, an invisible force that seemed to taunt me. I began avoiding certain trails, making excuses to stay near the station. My performance suffered, and eventually, I made the decision to resign. Now, I avoid the forest entirely. Even driving near it fills me with an unshakable dread. The memories linger, vivid and raw, and though I've tried to move on, I know the cabin is still out there, waiting for its next victim. The only thing left was a faint, glowing handprint burned into my jacket. Bigfoot's warning. I'm a wildlife photographer. My work has taken me to some of the most remote and beautiful places on Earth, but none of them prepared me for what I encountered in that forest. It started as a routine expedition, a tip from a local about a restricted area, untouched by human hands. I'd heard rumors of elusive creatures in those woods, whispers of something extraordinary waiting to be captured through my lens. I couldn't resist. The first day was peaceful enough. I set up camp near a stream, marveling at the towering, ancient trees around me. There was a strange stillness in the air, though, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. At first, I dismissed it as nerves. I'd been in isolated places before. It always took time to adjust. But that stillness, it wasn't natural. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the forest. It was then that I found it, a massive footprint embedded in the soft earth. It was far too large to belong to any human or animal I knew of, and the shape, broad with deep grooves, was unmistakably unique. I crouched down, placing my hand next to it for scale, and snapped several photos. As I stood, the first sound came, a sharp, resonant knock that echoed through the trees. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a thick branch. My heart raced, but I laughed nervously. Probably just a coincidence, I thought. But the knocking didn't stop. As I hiked further, it grew louder, closer. My unease deepened when I began noticing tree structures. Branches twisted into unnatural arches, stacked into crude shelters. Each one was more intricate, more deliberate. I photographed them all, hoping to analyze them later. By the time the sun began to set, I'd captured dozens of shots, but none of them brought me any comfort. The forest felt alive, like it was watching me. That night, as I reviewed my photos by the fire, I heard it, a guttural roar. It was low and resonant, cutting through the silence like a knife. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. My camera trembled in my hands as I turned toward the sound, scanning the trees illuminated by the flickering firelight. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and for a moment, I thought I saw a form. A twisted, skeletal silhouette with jagged edges, emerging from the darkness. Its movements were jerky, almost glitch-like, as if it didn't belong in this world. I called out, but my voice sounded weak against the oppressive quiet. Then the forest came alive. Branches cracked in the distance, and heavy footsteps circled the camp. I couldn't see what it was, but it felt deliberate, like whatever was out there was testing me. The fire sputtered and dimmed, as if the creature's very presence drained the air of warmth. My breath misted, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. Shadows danced across the trees, elongating unnaturally, as if they were alive and reaching for me. Then came a sound I couldn't explain, a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. It wasn't a noise of this world. The skeletal silhouette I had glimpsed earlier now seemed to multiply, more jagged forms flitting between the trees. They moved erratically, glitching in and out of view like a broken signal. My camera was useless. Every attempt to capture them resulted in distorted images, as though the creatures repelled technology itself. A strange pressure built in my ears, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, guttural and ancient, but the tone was clear. I wasn't welcome here. I turned toward the direction of the sound, and my fire flickered violently, throwing the clearing into momentary darkness. When the light returned, a large gash had appeared in a nearby tree, dripping a black, tar-like substance that smelled of decay. Panic set in. Whatever was stalking me wasn't just a creature. It was something more malevolent, something that didn't belong in this world. The forest felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to mock my every move. I clutched my camera like a lifeline, knowing it couldn't protect me, but it was the only thing grounding me in reality. Whatever this was, it was more than a predator. It was a force. Then I saw it. A pair of faint, glowing eyes peering from the darkness, too high up to belong to any known predator. They blinked slowly, unhurried, as if whatever it was had all the time in the world to decide my fate. A low growl resonated from behind the trees, so deep it felt like the ground itself was vibrating. It was not an animal sound. It was something older, more primal, like a guardian or a predator from another time. Whispers came from all directions, as if the forest had come alive to warn me, or trap me. Whatever this was, it wasn't just hunting. It was toying with me, letting me know that escape wasn't an option. I barely slept that night. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sending my heart racing. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching, it was stalking. By dawn, I'd had enough. I packed my gear, determined to leave. But as I folded my tent, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. It echoed all around me, a chorus of deep, resonant thuds. My hands shook as I grabbed my backpack. Something didn't want me there. I decided to take one last walk before leaving, hoping to make sense of what I'd experienced. That's when the chase began. Heavy footsteps thundered behind me, each one sending vibrations through the ground. I ran, my camera bag bouncing against my back. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at me as I stumbled over roots and rocks. I tripped and fell hard, the breath knocked out of me. When I looked up, I saw it. A massive figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. It was Bigfoot, larger than any creature I'd imagined. Its fur was dark and matted, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. My first instinct was fear, but the creature didn't move toward me. Instead, it raised one massive hand and slammed it into a tree, producing a knock so loud it made my ears ring. I stayed frozen, too stunned to run. Bigfoot's movements were deliberate, almost calculated. It gestured toward the woods, then at the ground, where faint claw marks were etched into the dirt. I could see the urgency in its glowing eyes. It repeated the gesture, then dragged its hand across its throat, the universal signal of danger. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't threatening me. It was warning me. Before I could react, a guttural roar erupted from deeper in the forest. Bigfoot stiffened, its head snapping toward the sound. It let out a low, resonant growl, a sound that vibrated through my chest. Without another glance at me, it grabbed a fallen branch and slammed it into the ground, creating another thunderous knock. Then it turned and disappeared into the shadows, moving swiftly but silently. I didn't wait to see what it was warning me about. I ran, adrenaline propelling me forward. The roars grew louder as I fled, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally broke through the tree line and onto the dirt path that marked the forest's edge, I collapsed, gasping for breath. The forest behind me was silent again, too silent. Back at my studio, I reviewed the photos, desperate for answers. Most were clear, but the ones showing the footprints, tree structures, and the shadowy figure were distorted or erased. It was as though the forest itself had decided what I could and couldn't take with me. Just as I began to dismiss it all as paranoia, I found the last photo. It showed the clearing where I'd seen Bigfoot, but far in the background, its faint outline was turned toward something larger and darker, looming just out of focus. My blood ran cold. Whatever it was, Bigfoot wasn't the monster. It was the warning. The screaming fog. We'd been planning the camping trip for months. It wasn't often that we managed to gather everyone together. Me, my wife, Emma, and our 2 kids, Jake and Lily. Between work, school, and the chaos of everyday life, a weekend in the woods felt like the perfect escape. We'd chosen a remote campsite, nestled in a dense forest far from the buzz of civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just us and the great outdoors. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp, cooked dinner over the fire, and told stories under the stars. The kids laughed as Jake teased Lily about her fear of the dark, and Emma and I exchanged smiles, happy to see them getting along for once. By the time we crawled into our tent, the forest was alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. I fell asleep with the reassuring hum of nature in my ears. I woke up before dawn to an unsettling silence. The usual symphony of the forest was gone, replaced by a thick, oppressive quiet. When I stepped out of the tent, a dense fog had settled over the campsite. It wasn't the kind of mist you'd expect in the early morning. This fog was unnaturally heavy, clinging to everything like a living thing. I could barely see a few feet ahead. Emma joined me moments later, her brow furrowed as she wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "What is this?" she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "Fog," I said, though the word felt inadequate. There was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. The kids woke up not long after, Jake complaining about the cold, while Lily clung to my side. The fog seemed to dampen everything, our voices, our movements, even the light of the rising sun. We decided to wait it out, hoping it would clear by mid-morning. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from deep within the woods, a long, anguished cry that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Emma grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Probably just an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. No animal I'd ever heard made a sound like that. The scream came again, this time from another direction. Then another and another, each one fainter but no less chilling. They seemed to echo all around us, bouncing off the trees and disappearing into the fog. The kids clung to us, their faces pale. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice firm. I nodded, but as we began to pack up, the screams stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Waiting. By the time the fog began to lift, we were almost ready to leave. That's when we noticed Lily was gone. Panic set in fast. One moment she was there, standing by the tent, and the next she wasn't. Emma screamed her name, her voice cracking with desperation. Jake and I fanned out, searching the perimeter of the campsite. We found nothing, no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading the way. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. "She wouldn't wander off," Emma said, her face streaked with tears. "She's too scared of the dark." We searched for hours, calling her name until our throats were raw. The fog had mostly cleared by then, revealing a forest that felt somehow unfamiliar, as if the trees had shifted in our absence. Exhausted and defeated, we collapsed by the fire pit, unsure of what to do next. Then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the campsite. "Lily!" I shouted, leaping to my feet. Emma followed, relief flooding her face. But as we got closer, something about her seemed wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. She didn't blink, didn't respond to our calls. She just stood there, staring at us with wide, unblinking eyes. Then she raised a hand and beckoned, her fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. "Lily, come here," Emma cried, but she didn't move. Instead, she turned and walked into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me not to follow. But Emma was already running after her, and I had no choice but to go with her. Jake trailed behind, his face pale with fear. The fog returned as we entered the woods, thicker than before. It wrapped around us like a shroud, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. We called Lily's name over and over, but the only response was the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional distant scream. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground was littered with bones, some small and animal-like, others disturbingly human. My heart pounded as I tried to keep Emma and Jake close, but the fog seemed to conspire against us, pulling us apart with every step. Then we saw her again. She was standing in a small clearing, her back to us. "Lily," Emma sobbed, reaching out to her. But as her hand brushed Lily's shoulder, the figure dissolved into the fog, leaving behind nothing but a faint, sickly, sweet smell. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, freezing us in place. The air grew colder, and the fog seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin like a living thing. Then it appeared. The creature was massive, its emaciated frame towering over us. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Antlers jutted from its skull, twisted and jagged like the branches of the trees around us. It moved with a horrifying grace, its elongated limbs bending in ways that defied logic. It opened its mouth, and the screams we'd heard earlier poured out, a cacophony of voices trapped within its maw. I clutched Jake to my chest as Emma stumbled back, her face a mask of terror. The creature didn't attack. Instead, it circled us, its glowing eyes fixed on each of us in turn. It was studying us, feeding off our fear. I could feel it, a gnawing dread that sapped my strength and made it hard to think. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. Now. We turned and ran, the fog closing in around us. The creature didn't follow immediately, but as we sprinted, its voice echoed through the trees, freezing us in our tracks. "Mommy, come back," it wailed in Lily's voice, high-pitched and heart-wrenching. "Mommy, don't leave me." Emma let out a strangled sob, her steps faltering as the voice grew louder, more desperate. "It's her," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's Lily." "No," I snapped, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. "It's not her. Keep running." The fog thickened around us, the wailing shifting into a guttural, bone-chilling laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The weight of its presence grew heavier with each step, pressing down on my chest until I thought I might collapse. The screams faded just as we broke through the edge of the forest, stumbling into the pale light of morning. For a moment I thought we were safe, but the silence that followed was suffocating, as if the forest was watching, waiting for us to make one wrong move. Disoriented and shaking, we stumbled back toward our campsite. The fog seemed to have lifted entirely, leaving everything eerily untouched, as if nothing had happened. Our tent stood where we left it, the fire pit cold and empty. The sight of our belongings should have been comforting, but instead it felt wrong, as though we were intruders in a place that no longer belonged to us. Emma was the first to speak. "We have to leave. Now." I nodded. "Forget the gear. Just get in the car." Jake hesitated, his gaze darting back toward the forest. "What about Lily? We can't just leave her." "We're not staying here," I snapped, harsher than I meant to. My voice cracked with fear and desperation. "We'll get help. We'll come back with people, but we can't stay." We piled into the car, leaving everything behind. The tent, the backpacks, even the camera that had captured our memories. The engine sputtered to life, and I gripped the wheel tightly, the tires spinning in the dirt as we sped away. The road twisted through the woods, and I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see lurking behind us. When we finally reached the highway, Emma let out a shaky breath, and Jake started to cry softly in the back seat. None of us spoke. The weight of what we'd left behind, what we'd lost, pressed down on us like the fog had. Even as the sun rose higher, bathing the world in light, the shadows of that forest stayed with us. We never found Lily. Her absence was a wound that never healed, a shadow that hung over us long after we left the woods. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear her voice, faint and distant, calling me back to the forest. I've never gone back. I know if I do, I won't return. The forest that hates technology. "We're rolling," Diego called, adjusting the focus on his high-end camera. Joni took her place in the center of the frame, her bright smile glowing against the backdrop of towering trees. "What's up, Survival Squad? It's your girl, Joni, and today we're taking the ultimate challenge, a full 48 hours in the heart of the Forbidden Forest." Behind the lens, Hector made a mock shiver. Forbidden Forest sounds like a horror flick already. "Don't jinx it," Valeria muttered, tightening the straps of her backpack. She kept her gaze on the tree line, her demeanor calm but wary. Unlike the others, Valeria wasn't here for the content. She'd grown up hearing whispered warnings about the forest from her abuela, who called it cursed. Valeria hadn't wanted to come, but Joni's persistence had worn her down. The group set off, their gear packed tight. Diego carried a drone, extra batteries, and a laptop, eager to capture drone shots for cinematic flair. Hector brought a handheld thermal camera and a spirit box, hyping up his audience with tales of ghost sightings in the forest. Joni led the way, her enthusiasm infectious, while Valeria trailed behind, her machete swinging lightly at her side as she marked the path. The forest loomed ahead, dense and shadowy. It swallowed their laughter and chatter the moment they stepped past the warning sign. "Do not enter." "Creepy much?" Hector said, pointing to the graffiti scrawled beneath it. "The forest watches." "Perfect clickbait," Joni replied, her confidence unwavering. "Let's do this." But as they ventured deeper, the sunlight began to dim unnaturally fast. Valeria glanced at the canopy, her frown deepening. We should keep moving. It gets colder here faster than you'd think. Unseen by the group, a ripple passed through the trees, as though the forest itself had shuddered. Bulgarian and survival challenge. As the group reached a clearing, they set up camp, their banter filling the air again. Diego positioned his camera on a tripod, capturing Joni's animated description of the ultimate survival challenge. Hector scanned the perimeter with his thermal camera, his usual humor replaced by a furrowed brow. Valeria unpacked quietly, her movements deliberate as she kept glancing toward the tree line. Anyone else feel like we're being watched? Hector asked, breaking the rhythm of their preparations. Joni snorted. That's the whole point, right? Get our audience spooked. I'm serious, Hector replied, lowering the camera. There's something off here. It's just nerves, Diego chimed in, adjusting the angle of his drone. Places like this mess with your head. Or maybe it's because the forest doesn't want us here, Valeria said quietly. The weight of her words hung in the air, silencing even Joni for a moment. The first glitch came as Diego launched the drone. The feed on his laptop flickered, lines of static interrupting the smooth footage. He frowned, tapping at the keyboard. Weird. Must be interference from the trees. Let me see, Hector said, leaning over. For a moment the screen cleared, showing an aerial view of the dense forest. Then a figure appeared, tall, humanoid, and motionless, standing among the trees. What the hell is that? Hector asked, his voice low. Diego rewound the footage, but the figure was gone. Just a shadow, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Joni laughed nervously. Okay, guys, don't freak out. Let's stick to the plan. But the glitches didn't stop. As the group filmed their first challenge, Diego's camera flickered, the image warping and distorting. A high-pitched whine came through the microphone, sending shivers down everyone's spine. Cut, Diego said, pulling the camera off the tripod. He inspected it, shaking his head. Nothing's wrong with it. It's not just the gear, Valeria murmured. It's this place. Joni waved her hand dismissively. Come on, we're overthinking it. The footage will look great. Weird glitches just add to the vibe. But as night fell and the forest grew silent, even Joni couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The night was unnaturally quiet. Not a single insect chirped, not a single leaf rustled. The air felt heavy, pressing down on their camp like a lead weight. Diego cursed softly as his laptop screen turned black. It's dead, he muttered, shaking it as though that might fix the issue. How? You charged it this morning, Joni said, leaning over his shoulder. I don't know. It just stopped working. Hector's thermal camera blinked off next, the screen going blank with a faint hiss. This is no coincidence, he whispered, his voice tight. Valeria sat on a log near the edge of the clearing, her machete resting on her lap. She stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, her eyes narrowing. My abuela used to tell me stories about this place, she said suddenly, her voice low and distant. The others turned to her, their unease momentarily giving way to curiosity. What kind of stories? Hector asked, leaning closer. Valeria's grip tightened on the handle of her machete. She said the forest is alive. It's not just trees and dirt. It's something older, something that knows. She told me it watches people who come too close, waiting for them to make a mistake. And when they do, it takes them. Diego scoffed nervously. Takes them? What does that even mean? Valeria didn't answer right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the tree line. She said it doesn't like people who don't respect it. It hates fire, tools, anything unnatural, and it especially hates cameras. Her voice wavered. She used to warn me never to wander off too far, to stay where the forest could see me but not notice me. I thought she was just trying to scare me as a kid, but now. She trailed off, her words hanging in the heavy air. A faint cry echoed through the forest, distant but unmistakably human. Joni stood up, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Maybe it's someone who needs help, she said. Or maybe it's the forest itself, Valeria muttered under her breath. Playing with us. The group trudged forward in silence, their jokes and bravado long forgotten. Valeria led the way, her machete carving faint marks into the trees. She froze suddenly, her eyes narrowing at something half buried in the ground. "What is this?" she murmured, crouching to uncover it. It was a carved stone tablet, covered in intricate symbols that glowed faintly as the light from Diego's flashlight hit it. The carvings depicted figures with elongated limbs surrounding what appeared to be a massive tree with eyes. "It's some kind of warning," Valeria said, her voice trembling. "Or ancient fan art," Joni said, trying to lighten the mood, but her voice wavered. Diego aimed his camera at the tablet, but the screen flickered and distorted again. "Come on," he muttered, smacking the device. Before anyone could respond, a guttural growl echoed through the forest. Hector spun around, his flashlight catching a fleeting glimpse of something pale and skeletal darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" he hissed, backing into the group. "I don't know," Valeria said, gripping her machete tightly. "But we need to go. Now." The growls grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Diego aimed his camera at the darkness, his hands trembling. The lens focused briefly on a humanoid figure, its hollow eyes glowing faintly before it disappeared. "We're not alone," Joni whispered, her confidence finally cracking. The group broke into a run, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they navigated the uneven terrain. One by one, their devices failed. Diego's camera, Hector's flashlight, even Valeria's compass spun uselessly. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees closing in as if alive. "Where's Hector?" Joni shouted, her voice cutting through the rising panic. They stopped, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they scanned the darkness. Hector was gone. "He was right behind us," Valeria said, her voice trembling. "We have to go back." Before they could decide, a figure stepped out from the shadows ahead of them. It was Hector. At least it looked like him. "Guys," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It's fine, we're safe." Valeria took a step forward but froze. Something was wrong. Hector's movements were stiff, unnatural, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "That's not him," she whispered, gripping her machete. "What are you talking about?" Joni asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure smiled, but the expression didn't reach its eyes. "Come with me," it said, the tone flat and devoid of emotion. "We're safe now." Diego stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering wildly. "Run," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Run." The figure stood there with an extended arm as an invitation. "Come back, I want to play. Don't leave me." By the time they reached the edge of the forest, they were trembling and empty-handed, having abandoned their gear in their desperate flight. None of them looked back, too afraid of what they might see. Later, when Diego reviewed the corrupted footage on a spare memory card, he found a single, clear image. The figure that had posed as Hector, its skeletal frame and glowing eyes staring directly at the camera. Behind it, the forest loomed, its shadows curling like fingers around its edges. And so, our journey through the woods comes to an end. But the forest? It never truly sleeps. For every tree that stands tall and silent, there's a shadow waiting to move. For every trail that seems clear, there's a path that leads somewhere it shouldn't. Tonight's tales remind us that nature holds more than beauty. It holds secrets, mysteries that defy logic and challenge our sense of safety. Whether it's a cabin that disappears, a warning from a creature we barely understand, or a forest that fights back against human intrusion, one thing is certain. Some places were never meant to be explored. So the next time you step into the woods, tread lightly and keep your eyes open. You never know what might be watching. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.